beautiful park somewhere. Thank you so much for joining, Chirag.
Hi, Joy. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here today, and really thank you for having me on the show. I've looked through some of the people that you've spoken to in the past, and there are some people doing some really great things. I'm not sure if I'm quite there, but I'm really delighted to be on the show today.
That's wonderful. And thank you so much for joining us in such a beautiful place. Where are you right now?
So today I'm outside in Tokyo in the grounds of the Imperial Palace. So around me are the matsu, the trees that are planted just in front of the palace, and it's a beautifully maintained lawn here, and yeah, it's a real break to be from it's a real respite from the hustle and bustle of the city.
Definitely. And you said you can hear some cicadas around you right now?
Absolutely, absolutely. I think if I wasn't wearing this headset, you'd probably get more of the cicadas than my voice.
Well, being in nature is such an important part of what we're talking about today, and your study and your recommendations and consulting about permaculture, which is a real balance between people, planet, and profits. Very similar to the sustainability key pillars, which I often talk about on many different topics. We have had people talking about permaculture before, and we're going to dive into the specifics in just a minute. But I'd love to know more about how you first came to Japan. I know you were a jet in Kagawa. Is that right? And then you
Oh,
left and came back?
yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah, so that's right. So I first came to Japan. This is going to date me, but after finishing university back in 2003 it was. And I came to Japan. It was purely something that happened out of chance. I was at my university careers recruitment fair, and it seemed like a really exciting opportunity to go and travel, to go to a different to learn a different culture. So I took that up, landed myself in Kagawa in Shikoku, where I stayed for 2 years at a senior high school in a town called Sakaide. So this was a good balance for me to give me a chance to see a bit of rural Japan, as well as being close enough to the larger city. So I was in a position where people in my community didn't speak English. So I was forced to learn Japanese. I was forced to to learn to interact with them, and through learning Japanese, I could become friends with them. I could learn more about their culture, and yeah, it was a really enlightening experience, and that stayed with me when I returned to England. And I did a few different things in England, and I I came to this thinking that I really liked speaking languages, and through that, I was lucky enough to find a job working at a Japanese company and working in IT. So I worked in IT, and at some point, I met my soon-to-be wife in England, in London, who also coincidentally happened to be from Kagawa. So we decided to get married and then settle in Japan, and that was about 10 or so years ago, and I've been living in Tokyo ever since. And also, yeah, working in IT. So I do I work in technology currently, and I think it's something that happened to me over the past few years is a realization. Well, firstly, is an appreciation for nature. Um, I'm not sure if you've got some of those, if you're able to show some of those photos, but some of my hobbies are cycling. And if you've ever done any cycling in Japan, you'll know that if you want to get out of the city, you're almost invariably going to end up in the mountains. And through that, I got to really appreciate the countryside, the really beautiful countryside of Japan. And also through cycling, you do end up going through some really depopulated areas, and also end up interacting with people in where people are not so used to seeing non-Japanese. And this has also given me a really great opportunity to interact with people on a really one-to-one, on a really straightforward basis, without any hierarchical. I think you'll find that if you're in a city, quite often you're speaking to people through, if it's through a workplace or if it's through a business acquaintance, it's through some kind of a hierarchical
or
system.
even as a customer, right?
Right, or even as a customer, or exactly. So, or there's a client, or there's some obligation on you. There's some kind of a social obligation. There's a way that you need to behave or conduct yourself, and maybe that means that you can't really speak about or talk about the topics that you really feel like talking about, or have share the feelings that you truly have, or ask the questions you truly want. So this like my time in the countryside has also given me the chance to speak to people, understand what these issues are. And I do take it upon myself to try and visit. I know you've had people on your show talk about taking extended trips, so I'm not going to talk more about that. But this level of interaction and appreciation of the kinds of problems that are prevalent, the depopulation, the aging society. Sometimes there are abandoned land plots in the countryside. There's a lot of these things that are really prevalent in Japan. And um, through being here, I've come to see that there's a huge contrast between the very dense cities and the neglected, very, very sparse countryside. So, and through this, I've also come to understand some of the environmental issues that Japan has faced through its, people may not say Japan is deforested, but you'll see these large urban conglomerations, which are where the concrete will stretch for kilometers on end, and you'll even go into the countryside and you'll think, okay, this is a nice forest, but when you look deeper, you'll realize that these are planted sugis, or these are planted hinokis, and these are not native forest. And um, when I first saw this, I was like, why are all the trees the same? And then, as I read about things and I looked into things a bit deeper, I began to understand that, yeah, there are, some real significant environmental issues that are going on in Japan. And
Is that
also,
is that
yeah,
what led you to studying more about permaculture?
yeah, I would say so. I would say that, yeah, it did give me, it was one of the things that made me realize that, yeah, that Japan has a history. With talking to people, I realized that actually not that long ago, um, this is in people's grandparents' generation, that grandparents were using homemade fertilizer, using their vegetable scraps, using things that they made at home to make compost and put on their fields, and pretty much everything they grew was organic. And Japan, being a country of very, very limited resources, um, didn't have synthetic fertilizers, right? They didn't have access to fossil fuels that were needed to make this. So they didn't have access. It wasn't financially possible for them to do this. And I know you've had, again, someone on your show talking about Edo, but I'll mention it again. But in the Edo period, um, human waste was a very, very valuable commodity. So these important nitrates, let's call them nitrates, were very, very useful for the fields, and they were traded actively. And this was closing the loop, and a really important part of agriculture, and really helped um,
It was
Tokyo
it
to
was
become what it did. Yeah.
every the most impressive thing about that Edo period, which is also in the idea of Satoyama, and of course in permaculture as well, is the idea of everything in nature is reused. Nature doesn't waste anything. Nature
Right.
is so smart, and it's people who come in and create waste and thinking we know better. But when you leave it up to the natural balance, that's where we can really
Right.
learn and develop in such sustainable ways,
Yeah,
right?
that's so true, and that's so true. And the slide that you're showing up here is the permaculture. It's a graphic of the permaculture principles. I'm not going to detail them all because that would take too long. But exactly as you mentioned, create no waste is one of the permaculture principles. And if you do look at nature, that there is no waste. You'll see in the autumn, for example, ginnan are very popular are very common throughout Japan, and you'll see ginnan will fall to the ground. They'll fall to the ground, and they will decay. And what exactly is decay? Decay is to an urban person, it's dirty, it's smelly, but decay it's a bacterial and a fungal process whereby um, the nutrients in the ginnan are metabolized into nutrients for the soil, and these nutrients in the ginnan are going to go to fertilize the soil, and they may help the ginnan seed to grow. In addition to making sure the ground around it will be nice and fertile for other plants to grow. So this is a really important point of permaculture where we don't create waste. And a real important point is this idea that we have of waste and gomi and landfill and bunbetsu. It's a very human created concept, and I'd go so far to say it's something that's created in the past 50 to 100 years, where we make something, um, we extract something from the ground, we'll mine it, we'll manufacture it, we'll make it, we'll use it, hopefully a few times. Let's hope it's better than single use, but we'll use it a few times and then we'll throw it away. We'll chuck it out, and it will sit in
The
hopefully it will
landfill.
sit in some kind of a secure landfill. In
But
in a
it's
worst
isn't
case,
it
it
it's
might be released into the
crazy.
rivers.
The first time I visited Kamikatsu, which is the zero waste town, and they're trying to get away from this idea of waste as an end product that finished, because it's not finished. And people who study permaculture know this, that there is no throwing away and it's over. There is always after effect, right? So why not let it be a positive after effect? Why not let it be useful for the soil, or food for insects or animals, right? Like useful in some
Right.
way. And then that comes back and
Absolutely.
helps us, right?
Absolutely. And I mean, one example is, we might be, chopping vegetables at home, and those vegetables that we no longer need can easily be food for example, for our chickens that we might be raising, and those chickens might end up giving us eggs. Um, but if we're living in an urban situation, we may not have chickens. Many people who are viewing probably in Japan think I don't have chickens, but I live in a small apartment. Um, and yeah, the photos that you're showing there are a way that we can use waste to make compost. And compost, again, it's something that if people go and maybe take a moment when you're next speaking to your grandparents, I'm sure, especially if they're in Japan, they will almost certainly have knowledge of compost. And what compost is essentially it's using the nutrients may that we don't need or we don't want, and it's cycling them back and providing that nutrient and returning that back into the soil. So one way that we can do it is at our house. You can see these two bags. And this company, by the way, in case people are not aware, it's called LFC Compost, Local Food Cycling. And I think they're based in Fukuoka. I think they're a kind of like a social business, and they do these online events to explain how to use their system. And I'll mention there, what I've got here is food scraps. So what I'll do is I'll collect in a Tupperware, I'll put in a Tupperware a bunch of food scraps from cooking, and I'll fill that into this compost bag every morning, and that will be mixed up with an amount of carbon, which is given by the by LFC. You can also use so compost. So going back to the basics, compost is a mix of carbon and nitrogen. And this is going back to maybe what you might have learned at school, um, about the nitrogen process, about the carbon process. And without getting too scientific, the food scraps that you produce, which you can see in this graphic here, are nitrogen materials. So there's going to be a lot of water in them, and there's going to be a lot of nitrogen in them. And nitrogen is a really key component in any growing green. So this green that you see around me, the leaves, a significant component of them is going to be nitrogen. And if we have like leftover carrot or leftover leaves, cuttings from the spinach that we had, or maybe we've got some food that we don't, it's a little bit off, ちょっと腐ってる, we're not sure what we, rather than chuck it in the bin where it's probably going to be burned and never be used again, what we can do is we can mix that up with perhaps, we can just mix that up with some shreddings. If you've got a shredder at your home, you can mix that up with paper shreddings. You can mix that up with some dry leaves if you've got some dry leaves. I always like to say, 不要は不要なものではない。So fuyo is a really for those who don't understand Japanese, it's like dead leaves, it's humus. So if you've got a park near you, or you've got a backyard or a front yard, just gather those dry leaves, mix them up with your food scraps, put them in a bag. I will always say though, in Japan, is try and keep this bag closed, just because of bugs, and you don't want to be getting like too many bugs inside your compost, and mix it. And the key is just mix it. And you just keep feeding it every day. Add like if it's a bit smelly or if it's a bit squishy, add more carbon, add more dry leaves, the crunchies. We like to call them the crunchies. The carbon are the crunchies, and the nitrogen are the juicies. So things that are like squishy and a little bit smelly, they're the nitrogen, and the dry and the twigs and the bits of cardboard, and you can even use newspaper. Hay, wara is also a good thing. If you ever go to your rice shop and you get komenuka, which is like the leftover from your rice husk, or you can just ask your rice shop, please give me some komenuka. This is also a great thing to use in compost.
Wonderful. And a lot of people say it's very difficult if they live in an apartment to do composting, but you're doing a beautiful job with composting and growing some plants, food on your balcony, it looks like. Are you having much success?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's I would say composting is great for nowadays we're at home a bit more. We're cooking at home a bit more, I hope. It's a great thing to start, even if you've got a small apartment. Maybe I can, if I tell you the link for it's I think it's called LFC Compost. If I can send you the link later, or you can search it. They send a
Sure,
ready-made
sure.
kit.
Yeah, I'll
Um,
add it below.
yeah,
On your balcony, I
yeah,
noticed, and I love to see that
yeah,
you are combining different kinds of plants. And I think this is
yeah.
something people don't realize, that there's so much benefit to diversity in how you grow plants.
Absolutely, 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 there is. And again, this goes back to permaculture, which talks about diversity. And one of the things in diversity is, like you can see in that photo there, where I'm mixing up some of the plants there. You can see I've got some marigolds in there, and marigolds are really great to keep insects away. So if you've got marigolds planted in front of some of your lettuce leaves or some of your food crops, they're going to confuse some of the insects. And another good thing is, like, their flowers, they're going to attract attract, if probably not in an apartment that much, but if you're in a garden, they're going to attract bees, which are going to help with pollinating some of your flowers as well. So yeah, mixing things and like finding these mutually beneficial relationships. This is a real key point. We'll get onto it a bit later when we talk about permaculture. But you can do this on a larger scale, or you can do it also on a smaller scale. You can mix your basil, and you can mix your tomatoes, and you can mix some of these root crops with some above ground crops. So absolutely, if people are interested, just look into companion planting. If you're doing it in your garden, you can look into a polyculture, and these are really key elements. And it also staggers the season. It means that you'll get something if you've only planted one thing. If you've only planted tomatoes, come the summer you're going to get a lot of tomatoes, but you're not going to get things before and after. So if you've planted also different things, you're going to get things throughout the year.
Yeah, wonderful. It doesn't look like the screen share is coming in perfectly, but can you tell us a little bit about how you applied the permaculture concepts to Alishan Tengu, working with Jack and looking at his facility, which is a beautiful cafe and shop next to the river? How did that project come about? It seemed like such an interesting project.
Yeah, so this was yeah the so what happened with me was I had as I mentioned earlier, I'd had this real interest in the natural world and understanding environmental issues. And to me, permaculture is like a way of like we've detailed before, is like living more in harmony with nature. It's more kind of utilizing nature systems, which is so different from what our current agricultural system is based upon. So our current agricultural system is based on, like, let's grow one crop. When that crop's done, we're just gonna we're gonna plow the soil, and that soil will be dead. And then next year again, we'll put a whole load of pesticides and fertilizers, and then we're going to grow the same thing again. So what that cycle does is it really destroys the soil, and it really destroys any nutrient in the soil. And I'd come to this realization, seeing this is like really not a sustainable way of living. And I then came across the idea of permaculture, um, and seeing it being applied in small to large scale made me think, okay, what can I do as someone living in a small apartment, a small place in Tokyo? Um, so I decided to embark on this course, remote course run by Oregon State University, and I enrolled on it this spring. And as part of that, they wanted us to do some real practicals, and like get out there and do some and see what the real land was like, take some real measurements, make maps, and so on. So through that, I'd been acquainted with Jack through the organic community, through being an active person in the plant-based community in Tokyo, and having visited its cafe many of times, and also eating many of Alishan's products as well. And I spoke to Jack, and he talked to me about having a few problems with his land, and having some issues with degraded soil and so on. So I was like, well, may I use your land? Is it okay if I use your land as my project? So, and he was more than happy, and very, very cooperative.
Now,
In
for anybody who doesn't know, we've had Jack Bayles, from the founder of Alishan Tengu Farms and Cafe, on the series, really in the beginning of the series, and he has been such an important pioneer for anybody living or even visiting Japan who is looking for vegetarian or health food options. He was one of the first to start sending things from his shop in Saitama, and you can see Alishan Tengu products all over Japan in any health food shop now. So he's really created such a wonderful network. And he's such a generous person too. And I have not had the pleasure of being to his facility, so I'm so jealous of you. What a great experience.
Oh, okay. Well, Joyce, so next time you're in Tokyo, we'll have to go together.
Definitely, definitely. So, it looks like the first big slide was about the location. So, when you're doing a permaculture analysis like this, are you taking into account the height of the place or the water around the area? Tell us a little bit about what you're looking for at this stage.
So that's right. So permaculture, it really looks at a site. So wherever we do, so just to clarify, where we do permaculture, it's called a design site. And permaculture, it's the fundamentals are about design. So when we're trying to find a design site, in this case it was Jack's property in Saitama, we try to look at it holistically. We try to look at its location in the world, exactly as you say. We look at its elevation, um, and if you see in the subsequent slides, I've talked about the kind of climate that it has, the local the vicinity, how close it is to the river, how close it is to any water sources, any kinds of perhaps if it's like located in a disaster zone, if it's prone to flooding or if it's prone to high winds. We really before we even get down to planting or looking at any flora, we will really take a step back and analyze the site and analyze all this whole plethora of factors around it. And this you can see is a map I've created, and this is showing those blue lines. For example, they'll show like um, how the water flow is going on the site. Where is the water flow? So this will be really important when we're looking at plants. For example, like where do we want plants that like water? So we're going to put them to where the water can flow. Where are we going to site? Where are we going to capture our water? So if we've got a slope before where the site is entering, where water may flow, we may decide that we want to have some kind of a water capture receptacle at that point. So this is a really important thing when we're looking at a site in terms of a permaculture perspective.
That's great. And that really ties in with what I was talking about with indigenous culture and indigenous farming and using the natural landscape to capture water flows in a natural way, make sure that water coming out of your fields is as clean or cleaner than what came in. Also, Sato, the traditional Japanese approach of using natural flows through the valley, through the mountains. So permaculture is very natural, I would say, to the Japanese mindset about how traditional farming should have been done.
Y-
But in modern
yeah.
farming is so different, like you said, using so many chemicals and fertilizers.
Right. Yeah, that's a really important very very good point about tying it into Japan. And um and permaculture. So what essentially permaculture has done, well, the way I see what permaculture is it's something that draws on um a lot of indigenous farming cultures and practices, and essentially presents them to um, a modern audience in a more academic and methodical way. Because over the past 100, 200 years, maybe less in Japan, you know a lot of us who are living in cities, we've experienced this disconnect with what our ancestors used to do. And I guess what permaculture does is it presents a lot of these techniques that we used in the past, such as water harvesting. Quite often we'll go to an old house in Japan, and we'll see this water capture but I forget the name in, if you know, Joy, the name in Japanese.
I don't know the name in Japanese, but I know what you mean. It's like
Right,
a giant pottery vase
right, right,
that
right,
they
right.
capture the rainwater from the house or something, right?
Exactly, exactly. So we'll see that, and we'll see things like this that we used hundreds of years ago. So things like this, like capturing rainwater, is a really, really significant part of permaculture. Things like composting, which it has been used, a couple of generations ago. Composting was like, really, atarimae nakoto. It was like completely second nature to people in Japan. But that, again, it's been forgotten. So these are some techniques that are presented in permaculture. And I just want to tie in, like things about Satoyama and things about Japanese traditional farming. People on this show, yourself, you may have heard of Fukuoka-san, who is really revered amongst permaculturists. But he's, ironically enough, he's not that well known in Japan. But a lot of the work he did, a lot of the books he wrote, really inspired the permaculture movement. And a lot of what he said was, a lot of the ideas that he used, things like no-till, things like not plowing the soil, um, was a fundamental thing that he stood by, and that again is a fundamental, in permaculture. So in
Now,
permaculture, we
can I
won't
just
disrupt the
add?
soil.
So
Sure.
Fukuoka Sensei's famous book is called One Straw Revolution, and it's the whole idea, like you said, about no-till farming, leaving it up to nature. What I said earlier in the show about how man is trying to control nature and nature is smarter than us, and we need to accept that. That comes from that book. He was a pioneer in this idea that we are not smarter than nature. Nature is much smarter than us. We need to watch and learn from nature. And he came from a biology background. So he had training in man made techniques, which are supposed to be better. So he knew what he was talking about.
Yeah.
Really inspirational.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely true. And permaculture, yeah, again, like you say, it doesn't. It tries to replicate the systems of nature, and one of the things is like observe and interact, and it's and also like looking at patterns, like patterns to details. So in nature, if we observe, we are going to see like millions of patterns and millions of types of interactions. And I was watching the other day something that, humans disrupted. This was in something I saw in America, that it was actually on Japanese TV, surprisingly enough, where um, people hunted a type of a fish in the lakes of Lake Yellowstone, and they removed the bear's source of protein. So then the bears in Yellowstone had to go and start looking for a different source of protein, and they started like eating deer cubs. So, and then the deer population then massively dwindled. So all these like patterns and like all these integrations in nature, and there are just so many of these, that it's like really way beyond the realm of human understanding, and it's something that we cannot. So things, if we try to go against these, we're going to create changes, that will bring unforeseen circumstances. And again, that we've seen this with biodiversity loss, and this is what permaculture tries to replicate. And um, permaculture, like what I'm talking about right now, and what, you know I'm not going to say I'm qualified to even talk about what I'm saying, but based on my learning and my experience, is I'm talking about it on a small scale, and probably beyond the scope of this talk is like permaculture, integrating permaculture on a larger scale. And when we start doing this, we look for an alternative to uh, mass scale agriculture. So things like you may read about and you may hear about in the coming years are things like agroforestry and silvopasture, and these are ways that we can try to produce food for a larger population, but while still trying to conserve biodiversity. So while saying that, look, if we do want to grow some cereal crops, it's not necessary to clear all this forest. We can keep some forest, but we can grow cereal crops between the forest, and by doing this we are retaining that soil's ability to absorb carbon. We're not destroying like the habitat of the animals that live there. We're keeping these biological interactions, but we're still growing food for people, and we're still creating a surplus. So
That is so
these
important.
are the different
Yeah.
topics that you can touch on. Yeah.
Absolutely. And we have to change our idea of what is efficiency. That nature's efficiency and our modern idea of efficiency is so different, right? Like going and clearing a field of trees entirely and planting the same kind of crop over and over seems like efficiency, but actually it's very destructive to nature's balance and it's not sustainable. So we are learning
Absolutely.
so much from these kind of techniques. Now, I was so interested in this slide
Sure. Yeah.
about all of the detail of the compass. You have to take into account the wildlife considerations, the assets, is it assets and oh, amplify and
Deflect,
deflect
amplify and deflect.
for each
Right.
of these topics. I found that fascinating. Can you
Right.
talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So what this says, the sector compass, it's a it's a very interesting and quite and a little bit challenging thing to do. And actually, this can be done on any property, I would say, and it's a really core aspect of the permaculture design process. And quite often people don't spend enough time on this, only to regret it in the long run. So what the sector compass does is it looks at a variety of aspects, um, and it sees how they can either help the site or hinder the site. So you can see in this example that I've used, where we've got, for example, like the sun. So if we're at a site where there is no shade, so what that calculation, that little graph that you see at the bottom, is a calculation of the sun's angle, and this is something we all observe. Anyone, if you've lived in a house, you'll notice that in winter the sun is going to be more horizon, whereas in the summer the sun's going to be more overhead, and that's going to affect the level of light that you're getting. So this will be really essential to consider when you're siting your crop. So for example, if you've got a hedge, or if you've got a wall or a fence that's creating a shadow, you're going to want to consider that when you're putting plants there. So you're not going to want to put shade loving plants where, if half the year they're going to be in the shade of that fence. So other things to consider are things like the water. So are there potential ways in which you could be getting too much water on the site? Are there ways that you can deflect the water, perhaps by having a small channel, or a drainage channel, where you can channel that water to some sites, some areas that you can keep some kind of a muddy or marshy area, and have plants that like marshy areas, where, for example, in Jack's example, I said the marshy area, a lot of Japanese plants, because Japan gets so much rain. Um, I used in Jack's example, I recall the amount of rain was like 1,800 millimeters per year. And when I was looking at some of my colleagues, who were my colleagues or my co-students, in my cohort, where they were designing somewhere in the west coast of the US, where they're going to be getting like only 600 millimeters in a year. They were telling me, wow, you get 1,800 millimeters of rain a year. And I realized that we're blessed, with water, but sometimes that can be too much water. So we might want to look at plant species that like that kind of that dorodoro, that dorodoro type of soil. So one example in Japan is like fuki. So fuki is a perennial, and it can grow on riverbanks, and it doesn't need that much light, and it really likes well drained, and very wet soil. So this is one example, and planting this can help to prevent the soil from being eroded. So it's got this like real win-win. So you've got this niseki nicho type situation where it's going to protect, and it's also going to give you a perennial crop, and you can eat fuki, and you can have them with your rice, and you can pickle them, or whatever.
Yeah, I love that. I did a workshop with a plant-based kaiseki, so traditional Japanese chef at a ryokan in Nagano, and working with Tyler Lynch. And we had a great workshop. And one of the ingredients that he wanted us to get was fuki, and I'd never heard of it before. And it was amazing that I could get it at the local supermarket, that it was available. And it's a sansai, it's a forest vegetable that people usually go out, even now in modern Japan, go out and forage for themselves in local forests. And so these traditions are being preserved in Japan, and they're, so it seems like permaculture and these concepts would be easier for Japanese people to adopt, because they're already kind of aware of them or accepting of them. We see forest vegetables in different seasonal dishes and things. That's so interesting.
Yeah, yes, right. There is absolutely. I would say that going back again to like the Satoyama, it's people going to people's grandparents' generation. I think they are probably the people that are most in tune with these kinds of concepts, and also understanding the seasonal variances, understanding that being able to prepare for floods, and maybe less so over here fires, but having these kinds of variations and extremes in weather, and it's something that's really important to take into account. And this is again what this sector compass shows.
Another thing I thought was really interesting from your report was about soil analysis. So, taking into account the different kinds of dirt, soil, which we know is so important to any kind of growing of vegetables or food. Can you tell us about this a little bit? I love this part.
Yes, soil is something that's really really important, because it's the core of life. Anything that we eat is coming from our soil, and anything that we eat, it's going to become a part of us. So whether we like it or not, we are very very much we are very much living close to the soil, and the soil is very very important to us. And one thing that we do when we are analyzing a site is we are taking a soil sample. And in taking a soil sample, we are digging a small hole, and gathering a clump of soil. We do a little, what we do is it's called a jar test. So you put the soil into a jar, you mix it up with water, you shake it, and you leave it to settle. And you can see in the photo there, when it's settled, it stratifies, and you get different layers. So what you're going to see in those layers are, you're going to see layers of sand, you're going to see layers of silt, and you'll be able to, through that, gauge to what type of soil that you have, and what crops are likely to thrive in that soil. And possibly, if your soil is perhaps too skewed, either because the soil has been neglected or if it's been eroded. So for example, if you've got if you've got like a backyard where nothing was planted, and as is typical in Japan, is it's just left as bare soil or gravel, quite likely that soil is going to be highly eroded, and that soil is not likely to support any kind of plant life, or at least any kind of any kind of food plants. So what will likely be needed is to necessary is to ameliorate the soil, and there are various techniques that we can do to improve, to ameliorate soil and add nutrients back into it.
And that's so important. I saw a documentary when I was doing my sustainable tourism masters about soil, and I think it was called Dirt, and
Okay.
it talks about the problems in India with the indigenous traditions of farming were so sustainable, so good for the soil, and then like many countries around the world, a lot of the pesticides came in. Oh, this is better. Use this, and then now they're really struggling to grow anything because, like you said, the soil is so eroded. And I think one of the people in the video, the thing that really struck me was she said some of the organic farmers or natural farmers, they'll eat a little bit of the soil to test it because they
Oh.
know that it's so good and it's so nutritious, and they don't mind even eating it directly. And I was so shocked by that. That's amazing.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, absolutely. I mean, compost at the end of the day, compost at the end of the day is, yeah, our bodies are comprised of nitrogen and carbon, so it's nothing alien to eat soil. And I think even another example is like, sorry to say this to some of your users, I don't want to discuss people, but even composting toilets, it's somewhat of a taboo in our modern society to say that, yeah, we need to compost our toilets, but whether we like it or not, our poo contains like huge amounts of nutrients, things like phosphorus, for example, which is really, really crucial in growing a huge number of plants. And same like you said in India, and also in Japan, I talk to people and saying that they, and I talked at the start of this show, like using composting our human waste was like a really important step, and it's a way of returning those nutrients into the soil. And our modern ways of architecture, it really it does not allow the soil to regenerate, and it does not depend on, it's a one-way process. So if we grow wheat or we grow potatoes, we're going to till that soil is going to be plowed, the soil is going to be mixed, that harvest is going to be sent to the market, the soil is going to be left bare for a number of months, during which time the wind and the rain are going to erode the soil, blow off any nutrients in that, and the soil is going to be essentially lifeless. And then next season, the soil is going to need to be fed with a lot of synthetic fertilizers, which are again using a lot of resources, a lot of energy, quite often generated from fossil fuels to be able to grow anything there. And again, I'm not an expert, but I have read and I've heard from various studies that you know year upon year we need more and more fertilizers to render harvest from these soils. So essentially we are really compounding the problem, um, that we've already got.
It
And one
just
thing that
gets
permaculture
worse
does
and
is
worse. Yeah.
right. It gets worse and worse. It's like fixing, remediating, and regenerating the soil, and regenerating the environment and the ability for it to produce a yield. And
Yeah.
that's what I think is really important
And
in what we do.
there's so many great knock-on effects that work so well together. Like you talked about composting. So
Yeah.
if you do composting, you're not only reducing your food waste,
Yep.
reducing the amount of waste you have to put out, which has to be picked up and delivered to the waste center using fossil fuels, but you are also building up the soil and making better plants and capturing more carbon. There's just so many positive knock-on effects.
There's so much positivity. There's so much positivity, and like you mentioned, food waste, and it's something that people don't. It's again a little bit of a taboo, or it's not like mentioned in society, or it's I would say it's especially in Japan. I notice it's something that's hidden away. It's like it goes in the there's channels in the back. It's always at the back of the restaurant or the back of the supermarket, and it's taken away late in the night or early in the morning. It's kind of out of sight, out of mind, but it's something that it's really massive. It is massive, the amount of food waste that we produce. And I was like looking in this study that I've got here, and Japan produces this is data from 2014 showing that Japan produces 27 million tons of food waste per year, and that is close on a third of all food produced is just wasted. and
Which
um
is
and Japan, yeah,
especially horrible when you realize that there are people who are food insecure here,
absolutely,
right? So
absolutely.
what we have a
Right,
broken infrastructure
right,
in
right,
terms of
right,
our food system.
right.
Speaking of local food, though, one of the
Sure.
analysis you did for Jack for the Tengu cafe
Yeah.
area, I found so interesting. We were talking about sansai or forest vegetables or wild seasonal vegetables, and this is a great example. I love this analysis. This is a nice part of the report.
Yeah, I think this is again, it's like putting us back in touch with what people, a generation or two ago would have been like, really, really familiar with. And, people now are less so. And it's things that it's so bountiful in terms of the types of food that you can get in different seasons. And I remember when I was out in Nagano not so long ago, and uh, at a farm there, and I was spending time at a farm there learning about organic farming. And there it's quite commonplace just to like snip the yomogi. It's like, what should we eat for lunch? Oh, let's just snip the yomogi that we can find there, and snip that and just make tempura out of that. I think there's a few slides there that show. I think yomogi is on there. There might be orba that's on there. There's did I include udo? Is udo on there? I'm not sure if I put udo on there.
I,
Um,
I can't see. You've
it,
got bamboo, rapeseed, yomogi,
right, yomogi
ginkgo
there,
nut, fuki,
ginkgo
the
nuts,
Japanese herb,
fuki, absolutely.
nazuna mastake, which is a beautiful kind of mushroom, oba, and
Right, right,
bamboo.
right. Right. And then there's bamboo, which I think is still practiced. It's again a very fast growing crop. Bamboo is, which is again it grows natively in Japan. It's a type of grass. It grows really, really quickly. It sequesters carbon. It's got so many uses. We can eat the bamboo takenoko in spring. We can use the bamboo as a wood source. We can make so many different things from bamboo.
I'm a
It's
huge
got so
fan of
many
bamboo.
uses. Yeah,
Absolutely. And it's just underutilized in Japan. It needs to be used more.
absolutely,
I talked
absolutely,
with
absolutely.
author Winifred Bird, and her book is all about people around Japan who forage for natural wild foods in seaweed or in the forest. And she did a 15 course meal, all of bamboo in Kyoto. So
Wow.
it's and she was talking about how when bamboo stopped being used to make baskets or to make hats or to make tools, when bamboo decreased, then bamboo became a problem and spread everywhere. And in old Japan, it was never a problem. It was never overrun because people were using it. and then plastic replaced it and created all these other
Right.
problems, so every action has
Right.
a reaction, right?
Absolutely. And I think it's like it is what I do find nowadays is like when I do see businesses or I see places that are using these kinds of sustainable techniques, it's a great way to have to start a conversation and talk to people. Sometimes I'll go to a I'll go to a restaurant and they're if they're using something that's in season, or they're using something that is a practice that is sustainable. It's something that's drawing on what was used in Japan in the past, and it's like acknowledging and just showing your appreciation to them for making that realization. And Japan traditionally, going again on this issue of waste. I think I had this like literally yesterday. We were going to buy rice, and we always go and buy rice with our little cotton bag, and the fellow at the rice shop was saying that you know what, yeah, thanks for always doing this, and yeah, it really helps us, and he gave us a little bit. He knocked us a little bit off the price because he's not generating extra. He's saving the cost of the packaging that he's using, and he said that like about 1 in 10 of his customers are now using reusable or bringing their own like little sack, which is what they used to do back in the past. But that was something really welcome to hear. These kind of little stories and little interactions it's really really important, and it can really help people feel, generate that connection, and help people feel appreciated, and help that effort be realized.
Absolutely. And just asking, sometimes asking in a nice way, would it be possible to just use my own bag or my own container? Oh no? Oh, that's okay. But just asking, and then maybe the next time you go, they're like, "Oh, did you want to use your own bag?" Like they've thought about it. You're
Yeah,
developing a relationship, but also you're
absolutely,
creating a movement. So every
absolutely,
small action in a positive way can have a big effect in the long term, right?
absolutely, absolutely.
So we only have about 5 more minutes. Is
Sure.
there one more topic we haven't really touched on that you wanted to talk about?
Yeah, I think I've talked quite a bit on permaculture, and I've talked about, like, on the way that it relates to the environment, and how it can address a lot of our environmental issues. I think one of the key, before even the principles, I think one of the key points of permaculture, the key pillars are that I'd like to mention are the care of earth, a lot of which we've covered in this talk, care of people, and this also draws on this community side. It's like making sure that people don't do work that is demeaning or that is hazardous. And quite often in our modern economy, again, the unseen elements of our modern economy are we'll buy a phone, but there are people that are doing things that are hazardous or even close to slavery. They're doing mining, or they're doing things that are putting their lives or their families' lives at risk. And permaculture, an important part of permaculture, aside from just the aspect of plants and the aspect of growing, your garden, or whatever, is also the care of people. Um, and the third pillar of permaculture is something called fair share. It's like creating this thing that is like sharing with the community. And one example of my instructor, Andrew Millison, used when at Oregon State, that he used. He's a prominent permaculturist. Is on his home, what he does is he creates these fruit trees at the edge of his property, where there's little grapes growing there, and those grapes are what he shares with the community, because the passing school kids, when they're coming home from school, they're going to have these like really enticing grapes that they can pick on their way home. And it's a really it's a really really sweet, literally in many ways a sweet thing to do, and I would say is it's and again, if I can link that to what we do in Japan, is in Japan, like quite often, like if you live in Inaka, which it's really sad, it's forgotten in the urban area, but you're quite often, people in Inaka that I've spoken to, they say that they they randomly find daikon placed at their genkan, right? When the person has created a surplus of genkan, and it's like creating this fair share, and this is like where we go back to go back to how people have lived in the past, and like create this kind of a community.
It's so
Yeah,
important. And I saw in one of your pictures as well that you also do cleanup volunteering. And even if you don't live in a place where you're growing your own food and share your own food, you can volunteer and help your neighborhood clean up, or go down to a river or beach and help clean up. And that's also part of this giving back to help
sure,
other people, or volunteer at Second Harvest, which is also talking about food waste. So in terms
absolutely.
of permaculture, as well as the idea of sustainability I'm always talking about, is it's you cannot disconnect it. You cannot just talk about the planet or environmentalism, because of course people are so connected to that. And you can't just talk about business either, because business has a very strong effect. Making money has a very strong effect on people and planet. So having these three together and trying to find some kind of balance for all three, people, planet, and profits, is a really good goal that everybody should at least keep in mind, right?
Yeah, yeah, totally. Yeah, absolutely. I think it's like, yeah, I mean, it's not always easy for us to leave our modern lives. You know, right now I'm at a point where I'm like, looking toward, like, having learned about all this. Yeah, I hope to embark on a few projects in the future. But yeah, I completely understand that it's not always easy for people to relinquish their own lives, but exactly as you say, like balancing the people, planet, profits. People who are working. So say you're part of. A lot of what we're looking at now is like, for change to occur, it can't just be done by a handful of environmentalists who are seen as sometimes, but they're seen as mainstream society as a little bit left field. They might be seen as a little bit wacky. They might be seen as hippies, or whatever you want to call, whatever mainstream society chooses to call them. Putting that aside, I think environmental issues, they are being more of a concern, and they're being more recognized. Like, we've seen like environmental disasters in we've seen floods in Europe this year. We've seen wildfires. We've seen wildfires in Europe. We've seen like floods and wildfires in the same country, in different parts of the same country in Europe. We've seen floods in Japan for the past you know the past three or more years. We've seen like the people said this was a once in a decade rainfall, but that's happened like twice in 3 years. So we've seen things that are inexplicably linked to climate change. So I think corporations, governments, society is beginning to realize this. And what I can say to people who are maybe they're not like ready to go and step out and start on permaculture, or start a regenerative project, is to look at what they're doing, what their enterprise is doing, and let's say, what can we do? So for example, right now, like, a huge amount of energy is used by buildings. If there are vacant buildings, like if people are working at home, can we look to reducing the HVAC? Can we look to reducing the aircon usage? Look to reducing the energy consumption? Can we look to perhaps looking to, like, ways that they can look to their electricity from a renewable energy source? Can we look to myself in technology, like, for example, like looking to extend the use of our technological products? Can we repair and reservice? Can we and also in our everyday lives, is again going back to no waste, is can we rather than buying something that's so brand new, can we buy a bit, secondhand? Can we buy that, perhaps that thing that we needed, we can buy secondhand on even using Mercari, or even using, like, some online platform to buy secondhand. And instead of, like, perhaps we've got this item of clothing that we don't really wear, why not, instead of like throwing that in the trash or putting that or leaving that in our wardrobe, we can sell that, and that will be new to somebody else, and that's creating that, it's creating that newness and that excitement in somebody else, but we're passing that on. So maybe in selling, if we're selling a piece of clothing that's nice, that might prevent someone from buying something new, which is then, it's going back up the chain. It's preventing extra items being mined. It's being extra fossil fuel from being used to being creating something. So these kinds of things, I would say, like small things in our life, having those conversations, is a really, really important thing. And just do something small, and don't be defeatist. Don't feel that what I'm doing is too insignificant. Start by something and tell somebody else. Have a conversation. Put it on your, if you're good at using social media, there's lots of people who are good at social media, tweet that, Instagram it, put that on social media, and have that conversation about what you're doing, and that will then reflect, and that might start becoming, like, when I was, like, a few years ago, I was like bringing my bags to the shops, and sometimes I'd get funny looks, but now it's like atarimae, right? And now I'm like, I've been going with Tupperware, so people used to laugh at me, like, for bringing a Tupperware to the takeaway joint, or to the restaurant. They'd give me a funny look, but now it's like commonplace.
Yeah,
So I think it comes with, if I was seeing somewhere else, and it's like saying that, when, I think when 3% of people start doing something, it starts gaining recognition, and it starts becoming a bit of a movement. And I think that
that's
there's
true.
people like the Maimizu, people like Robin Lewis from Maimizu, who starts, like, by doing this water thing, and
Yeah.
when,
It's
right,
all about attitude too, right?
right,
Like,
right,
always just keeping an open mind, looking at your situation, trying to be honest, asking people who have a little bit of expertise in things like permaculture or gardening to give you some advice, doing research online. We have so many amazing resources. And if we have our mindset that we're just looking for better options, I need a new
absolutely,
washer. Oh, which one uses less water? Which one uses less energy?
absolutely,
I'm
absolutely,
shopping at the supermarket. Oh, which one has less packaging? Which one is made from my local area? Just making a decision to try to look for better options, and where it's available, trying to ask or use them, right? So
right,
it's of course the burden isn't entirely on the user. We have to also ask companies to change, ask our policymakers to make regulations higher so that everybody is pulled up to a better level of change, right? But I love all the ideas that you talked about today, and these are so important. And I wish we had more time. I think there's a lot more we could talk about.
absolutely. There's a lot we could, yeah, there's a lot we
Yeah,
could talk about. There's a lot we could talk about. But yeah, it's been great being on the show, and yeah, I think we've talked about. I've talked, we've been pretty scattered in what we've talked about.
but
But
it's all connected.
yeah, it is all connected. It is all interconnected, and a lot of what is said sometimes it's said in isolation, but yeah, it's really important to realize different things are so interconnected, and we live in a world that a small action can have so many, um, after effects, and a small conversation, like you said, talking to companies. One thing I do have noticed in Japan, I'm sure you've noticed it as well, is like this idea of the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. I do find it's thrown about a lot in Japan, but I'm not sure how much understanding there always is about what the SDGs are in Japan. But I'm hoping that more and more people will start to do it. And I think if it is something that you hear about in your company, a lot of these concepts that we realize about no waste, about like for example, like if you're a food service company or if you're generating a lot of food, making sure that is composted. Making sure that is definitely that is a part of SDGs. And
Yeah.
if you do have a sustainability department at your company, they will definitely be aware of the sustainable development, and making sure that they're aware that what we're doing links to these SDGs. Is it could be a driver. It could be like
Yeah.
the point that means whether it's done or whether it's not done.
Definitely, definitely. And we have so much more to talk about. So I'd love to have you on again sometime in a few months and we'll continue the conversation. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's been a pleasure, Joy. And thank you. And thank you to all your listeners. And I'm sure people will listen. I guess people are going to listen to it afterwards, and perhaps watch it afterwards as
Yeah,
well.
we've had almost 250 people just over watching now.
Okay,
So
great.
people can watch it on replays on YouTube or here on Haps and many other places, and then it'll be in podcast form as well. But thank you so much, everybody, for joining. Thank you so much, Chirag. That was wonderful. And have a great day. Take care and
Thank
do your
you.
community service. Get your vaccine. Wear your mask, use social distancing. We're having a big outbreak all across Japan right now. So please take care of yourself and take care of others. Thank you so much. Have a great day.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.